Happy Monday, and welcome to another episode of Cases That Should Have Gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Today we're talking about language rights. Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Remember how the Supreme Court of Canada decided a case a while ago that said that it was so constitutionally important to be able to have your trial in French and to elect to have your trial in French or English that a person's conviction was thrown out, notwithstanding that the evidence may have supported the charge? Well, you would think if another case came up where there was imperfect language rights compliance at trial, the Supreme Court of Canada would be interested in hearing it. But they weren't. At least that's the case of Altamond Little. He was an individual who elected to have his trial in French, and because of issues with respect to the lawyers and who actually was francophone or competent in French to run the trial, there was an interpreter at trial. The interpretation at trial was imperfect in that Mr. Altamond Little did not have perfect French interpretation. He never raised the issue at trial. His lawyer never objected to the manner in which the interpretation was being conducted. But on appeal, he argued that because the interpretation was flawed, his trial itself was unfair. Was denied leave to appeal by the Supreme Court of Canada, and here we are. And it does raise this very strange question. If we're so important about the right to have your trial in French, if that's such a significant issue, then what happens when we have this imperfect interpretation? If you're a person who is a fluent English speaker, 99.9% of the time, you're going to have a perfect trial in perfect English. Perhaps the, exceptions being witnesses who may struggle with English, but even then, you're entitled to get an interpreter for the witnesses in order to understand their testimony. And then you're going to have presumably a near perfect trial in English. So why should you be entitled to a less than perfect trial in French that's just good enough, which was effectively what the Court of Appeal ruled? It seems to fly completely in the face of the whole right to have your trial in French as good as you would have it in English. That's the whole point of recognizing the language rights issue that's set out in the criminal code, that it should be interchangeable, not one subservient or less than the other. But unfortunately, that is effectively what the Supreme Court of Canada has endorsed by not hearing this appeal. It really raises a lot of questions about where they actually stand on the line of language rights. And if this precedent stands for this idea that you can have a less than perfect trial in French, what about other languages, especially rarer languages where it's harder to find interpreters? And where's the cutoff for what is perfect enough or good enough for a trial? At what point does the interpretation become so flawed that it leads to an unfair trial? There's no clear articulation of how to determine that, where to draw that line. And it would have been helpful, at least for the Supreme Court of Canada, if they weren't going to overturn the Court of Appeal's judgment, at least to comment on that, to give some guidance onto how to determine that, because an assessment of the evidence and whether or not it would have led to conviction isn't enough. It's whether the accused actually understands and meaningfully participates in the process. And if the translation is less than perfect, then how can it be said that they actually had that opportunity? Hopefully, the Supreme Court of Canada will get the opportunity in the future to clarify these issues, but until now, we're stuck with potentially imperfect trials taking place in languages other than English. Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Cases That Should Have Gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Please like, subscribe, and share with your friends.